Money Arata. The world monetary order is changing. The change is gradual, but it is changing nevertheless, and that is unquestionable. For centuries, gold functioned as the world money that everyone trusted. After the Second World War, the US dollar took its role, and that is still the case today. But the emergence of Bitcoin, the concentration of US financial power, and the trend towards fragmentation of the international relations of recent years have slowly started to change this dollar-led world monetary order. And Russia's war against Ukraine accelerated everything, and it made all clear to the entire world how financial power is concentrated in the United States and in the US dollar. Russia invaded Ukraine, and Western countries did not directly enter the conflict. The world even considers now the risk of nuclear war. So instead of fighting with missiles, the United States, the European Union, and other allied countries decided to fight with the force of money. Russia has received international economic sanctions on a scale that has never seen before. All of a sudden, lines of credit were cut, contracts were broken, and Russian banks were even excluded from the SWIFT system, which interconnects international financial institutions. If SWIFT was seen in the past only as a technical solution, it has now become very clear that whomever controls that system also has great power to use this control according to political convenience. The United States decided that Russia deserved to be excluded and disconnected several Russian banks from the international financial system. The target was Russia, but this level of sanction and exclusion scared many other countries. Several international leaders have realized that it's not a very good idea to maintain a significant amount of reserves in dollars or US Treasury bonds, and that it is not possible to rely solely on the SWIFT system to interconnect with the economies of other countries. Gradually, these countries begin to think about alternatives, and three ways seem to be most likely to prevent an uncertain future for them: holding reserves in gold, in commodities, or Bitcoin. With this slow and gradual movement, we may be witnessing the emergence of a new world monetary order, and you can make or lose a lot of money from it. Please note that this is not financial advice. Read the full disclaimer before proceeding. Large countries may prefer gold. This would threaten the dollar's hegemony as the world's reserve currency. Now imagine what would happen if large countries like China or Russia decided to sell all their products on the international market, not for the dollar, which is usually the case, but for gold instead. Imagine if they decided to keep their stores of value no longer in dollars or US Treasury bonds, but in gold bullion. With the movement of these two giants alone, the demand for the US dollar would drop significantly, but it is likely that other countries that live in the orbit of influence of China and Russia would do the same, further diminishing the demand for the American currency. Now, what happens when the demand for a product drops a lot, but you keep the supply the same? The price drops. If that happens, the dollar depreciates, it loses strength and begins to be threatened as the world's reserve currency. Is this just an exercise in imagination? No. It is a possibility that could already be starting to happen. Financial power is too concentrated in the hands of the United States, and this is a risk for other countries, especially for the countries that are not aligned with the interests of the United States. Therefore, these countries would gradually begin to change their stores of value, leaving aside the US dollar and the US Treasury bonds, and maybe replacing them with gold. Now, the problem is that gold is not such a practical money to be used in large commercial transactions. Gold reserves don't have as much flexibility for division, transportation, to store. To ship gold bullion from one country to another, there is a huge cost that you have to be doing for checking the purity of the gold. There is also a cost for weapons and guards for the transportation, and there is also the security cost for more guns, more safes that you need to be storing all of that. Compare moving $1 billion in physical gold and moving the same $1 billion in Bitcoin. We're talking here about real gold in bars. We're not talking about certificates of gold ownership, which are just pieces of paper that promise, that carry the counterparty risk. With gold, there is an expensive logistical aspect, a security aspect that can take weeks to be transporting gold bars. Now, the transport of this value in Bitcoin, on the other hand, is instantaneous. In the case of extra security for very large sums, you could wait for 6 confirmation blocks, which is done in a little over an hour. Do you understand the difference between gold and Bitcoin? Bitcoin has a greater scarcity than gold because it is mathematically proven. The scarcity of gold is relative because we don't know how much more gold can be extracted from the depths of the sea and from the Earth's crust or even from asteroids. The Bitcoin authenticity verification process is simple and inexpensive because it is math-based. Now, the verification of gold is a very expensive process that involves chemical and electromagnetic processes, and to be completely sure, it is necessary to just melt everything. This process is so expensive and complex that there are rumors that the gold held in certain central banks has not been properly audited. Bitcoin has no central controlling authority, very similar to gold, but with the advantage of being completely digital, extremely divisible, and operable on its own network outside of this SWIFT system or any other system controlled by this or that country. Now imagine what happens to your money in this scenario. If you own dollar or invest in dollar-related assets, the devaluation will make you lose money. However, if you have bought gold or Bitcoin because you were thinking about this change before this international demand increasing a lot, you can multiply by several times the amount you have invested. Now here's something very important. When we're comparing here gold to Bitcoin, notice we're not talking about cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin is a financial asset category that is distinct from cryptocurrencies. In case you don't know still how to figure out how to understand this difference, you can take a look at the episode 15 of the Money Arata series at arata.se/money15. The international community has realized that it no longer needs to rely on the US dollar. In several conversations in the Money Arata series, we've shown you why it's bad to have all your wealth in a single country's currency. For example, if you are from Indonesia and all your investments are the Indonesian rupiah, when the rupiah depreciates too much, well, you lose money. If the government of Indonesia decides to issue more rupiahs, you will also lose money because then the values you had are now diluted. If there is some international embargo against Indonesia, you will also lose money. In the same way that it is bad for you to depend only on a currency that is controlled by a central authority, it is also very bad for other countries to depend so much on the US dollar. The world monetary order based on the US dollar came into being out of necessity and in a specific context after the Second World War. We explained this in the episode number 20 of the Money Arata series. But now, the context is changing. In the same way that the internet eliminated the middleman in industries such as communications, music, and movies, Bitcoin also has created a solution for currency exchanges that don't depend on a third party. When all countries use the dollar as the world currency, decisions made in the United States affect everyone. If the United States decides to print more money after the crisis of the thing, well, the inflation generated is exported around the world. When the US decides to raise the rates by the Fed, what happens is that the dollar goes up. Also, when the entire planet uses your currency, you have the power to impose sanctions that other countries don't. The United States has used this power several times against Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Afghanistan, and now Russia. Therefore, other countries are considering gradually changing their value reserves, becoming less dependent on the dollar. It doesn't matter whether the United States is right on merit or not. What we're talking about here is the danger of concentrating power in the hands of a central authority. This danger rose out of necessity, but now the context has changed, and all the countries are realizing that there are alternatives to reduce the concentration of power and promote a new world monetary order. The new world monetary order will be decentralized, and you can make or lose a lot of money from it. The idea of the United States in imposing economic sanctions was to attack Russia in an attempt to stop the country's war against Ukraine. But paradoxically, this attitude could end up turning against the United States currency itself, accelerating a change that was already starting to happen, but very slowly. Confiscation of Russian reserves was a clear signal to other countries that they should not be relying too heavily on the dollarized investments in US government bonds. Excluding Russia from the SWIFT system is a very, very clear signal to other countries that the international banking system has a controlling body, and that controlling body can punish anyone who is not aligned with the same interests. Now, imagine if Russia manages to sell its products by receiving other forms than the dollar. Could be gold, Bitcoin, commodities, or anything else. Imagine if, even excluded from the SWIFT system, Russians managed to maintain commercial transactions with other countries, such as China, Serbia, Hungary. Forced to create an alternative, the Russians and their allies can show the rest of the world that it is possible not to rely so heavily on the United States. And this does not mean completely eliminating the role of the US dollar or the SWIFT system, but rather making it clear that there are other paths and that not everything has to go through the White House. Now, okay, how does all of this affect your finances? If you have dollars, in that scenario, you'll probably lose money. With fewer countries using the dollar, the currency depreciates and your investments will fall. But if you have gold, Bitcoin, or other investments that will benefit from the fall of the US dollar, then you could make money, you can make a lot of money. There are predictions that speak of an appreciation of Bitcoin above 1,000%, with one Bitcoin being worth up to $1 million in the future. We explain all that calculation in detail in the episode number 9 of the Money Arata series. And even if it doesn't come to fruition anytime soon, even if Bitcoin is only up 500% or just 100%, well, still is a lot of money if you're well positioned. Changing the world's monetary order is not something that can be done overnight. The change is gradual, but it has already begun. If you look at it today, it is hard to think of a very big drop in the US dollar. The United States is the richest country in the world. American companies are the most valuable in the world. This is where cars, spacecraft, medicines, technology companies, and many other cutting-edge products and services come from. But the world is no longer so dependent on the United States for much. Food, for example, is largely supplied by countries like Brazil, France, Germany, Holland. Products such as clothing, toys, and electronics come largely from China and East Asia. Oil and gas come a lot from the Middle East, Venezuela, and even Russia itself. A very clear example that the change in the monetary world order has already begun is Saudi Arabia's decision to price the oil that they export to China in yuan and no longer in dollars. This could be a first step for the world's largest oil exporter to exchange part of their reserves in the US government bonds for other types of reserves. And China, by the way, may be one of the biggest beneficiaries of the sanctions applied against Russia. It might be that with these sanctions, the United States is basically throwing China once and for all in the hands of the Chinese, leaving the largest country in the world by territorial extension very dependent on China. Remember that China and Russia together have more than 1.5 billion people, not counting the countries in their orbit of influence, for example, Belarus and Kazakhstan. All these changes are already happening. They're not just thought experiments. In the past, few people believed that the dollar or the SWIFT system could lose strength, but slowly, this is starting to happen. To make money from the new money order, you need to be very well positioned in the assets that could replace the dollar. If the dollar is no longer the only globally accepted international reserve currency, it will be replaced by something. That something could be gold, could be Bitcoin, could be some commodity. The fact is that the asset that will be chosen will appreciate a lot with that change. There are opportunities for you to make money if you are well positioned in the asset that might appreciate in a new monetary order. Well, your net worth will take a leap in the coming years. It won't be an overnight change. But when you look back after a few years, you will be able to see a dramatic increase in your net worth. Now, the question is, how can you know which asset will replace or even partially replace the US dollar? The most obvious answer is gold. Gold functioned as an international store of value for centuries before being replaced by the dollar. Now that the dollar might lose its place, it is only natural for people to think of a resumption of gold as the world currency. This possibility has already been mentioned in the past. With every single economic crisis that comes along, there will be people talking about a return to the gold standard. Now, what is different this time is that the deletion of the EU SWIFT system and the unprecedented US sanctions on Russia had made it very clear how one country alone can wipe out another's economy as long as it has the key to the vault and the login of the system administrator. After gold, another asset that could be used as an international store of value is Bitcoin. But you need to remember that this change will not happen overnight. We're talking here about a slow and gradual transition that can last for many years. Today, there is no country that has large reserves in Bitcoin as an official part of their national treasury. El Salvador and the Central African Republic have adopted Bitcoin as their official currencies, but both are small countries with even smaller economies. China has banned Bitcoin mining and is working on its own digital currency. It is unclear whether Russia will adopt Bitcoin as a replacement for the dollar or whether it will favor its own state currency. In the current scenario, Bitcoin could be very well behind gold as a possible replacement for the dollar. But that can change over time. All it takes is for a large economy to opt for Bitcoin, and this could have a ripple effect influencing other countries to do the same. Another option would be for countries to keep their stores of value in some commodity that appreciates over time: oil, natural gas, other precious metals, or even non-perishable foods. Countries that have this type of commodity can reduce their exports to keep their values within their borders. And those who don't can decide to import rather than just be buying gold. Instead of exporting these products, taking the money and buying US Treasury bonds, these producing countries they can simply stop exporting and thus keep the value in their territories. Not in the form of money, but in the form of commodities, of products. If that happens, those who are well positioned in investments related to commodity exporting countries such as Brazil, China, Saudi Arabia, for example, could do very well in the short term. However, remember that commodities don't work well with money. In the long run, if the price of commodities goes up too much, what happens is that more people will want to be producing the same commodities as well and also sell those commodities. To understand all of that, you need to understand the episode number 9 of the Money Arata series. It's a little bit about stock and flow. The increase in supply drives down the prices, so the idea of storing commodities as a store of value goes down the drain. This is what has happened in the past in other commodity boom cycles. This is probably what will happen whenever a good that is not scarce enough to be used as a store of value starts to become more valuable. There is no certainty about the future. You need to be prepared for all possibilities. Now, if you came here this far thinking that we'll be giving you a foolproof tip about sell all the dollars you have and now buy gold or buy Bitcoin, I'm so sorry to inform you, but we're not here for that. Nobody is able to know what will happen in the future. All it takes is just for one single major unexpected event and then the world changes completely just one day. The only certainty is that we are in times of change. What happens in one part of the planet ends up affecting the entire world. You need to be aware of where your money is invested in order to profit from opportunities or at least to avoid bigger losses. A very safe piece of advice is not to trust 100% of your assets in just one single currency, especially a fiat currency that is controlled by a central authority, and that authority could be changing the rules of the game overnight. So consider distributing your wealth to at least a second fiat currency. For example, if you're in Turkey, think about having part of your assets in a US dollar, not only in the Turkish lira. But you can do even better than that and then choose Bitcoin, or even gold. I know it is hard to keep up with all these changing landscapes, especially if you have your day-to-day job and your job has nothing to do with finances. But if you want to see your investments multiply, there is no other way. You need to be aware of these scenarios and be prepared for various possibilities. The possibility of gold replacing the dollar is the most feasible for some people. In this scenario, the world would revert back to the gold standard that was abandoned back in 1970s. Instead of countries holding reserves of value in the US Treasury bonds or other dollarized investments, they would start hoarding gold. And as the supply of gold is very limited, the increase in demand would quickly generate a price increase. To take advantage of this scenario, you need to have investments in gold or gold-related assets before that change, that appreciation happens. And you can start by investing part of your monthly salary, making a strategy of forming an average price, a DCA, month after month, until you reach a percentage that you consider interesting for you to be doing this investment allocation. If the option of most countries is to maintain reserves in commodities, then it becomes even more difficult for you to profit from that. Then you will need to be well positioned on the right commodity before the price boom, and also know the right time to sell before the market increases the supply of that good and then lower the price. And finally, if Bitcoin ends up being chosen to fully or partially replace the dollar in this new world monetary order, then you need to start stocking up your Satoshis right now, your sats. Satoshi, as you may have learned in our Money Arata series, is a small, tiny fraction of Bitcoins. You need to understand now how Bitcoin works and how you can invest in the money of the future. And since it's so early and not many people believe this is a likely scenario, few people are using Bitcoin today. This brings the opportunity for you to buy Bitcoins at a good price with a good margin of safety for appreciation. It may not be 1000% in 5 years that some people predict, but still it can represent a huge appreciation for your wealth, regardless of which scenario materializes. Stay tuned for the opportunities to make adjustments to your investment portfolio considering all the various possibilities. Witnessing the change of the world monetary order is something very rare. If you know how to take advantage of opportunities, you can go through this rare event not only as an observer, as a witness, but as someone who actually knew how to get rich with all the changes that will happen. A new world monetary order might be emerging, bringing with it many risks and opportunities. The economic sanctions and the exclusion of the SWIFT system imposed against Russia turned on the yellow light for many countries, which now clearly see the risk of keeping their reserves pegged to the US dollar, US Treasury bonds. If the dollar is replaced, even partially, you can make a lot of money as long as you are positioned in the assets that will be chosen to replace the dollar. And we don't know whether it's going to be gold or Bitcoin or any other commodity, but you need to be aware and prepared for different scenarios. And for those of you who are interested in being prepared for all of this, now I invite you to take a look at our Diamond Hands course, which shows you everything you need to know about investing with Bitcoin. And you can see the course right now by going to the link arata.se/diamondhands.